Good morning. Thank you so much for joining our webinar, Elections in the United Kingdom, Understanding Voters' Concerns and Political Challenges, with Eunice Goes and Sir Julian King. My name is Mirjana Tomic. I host seminars and talks on politics and media in Europe for two Vienna-based organizations, Forum Journalismus und Medien, an organization that promotes quality journalism through professional training, and Presseclub Concordia, the oldest press club in the world. Because we all speak English, at least us in this Zoom space, and a lot of people in Europe, we listen to the BBC or read The Guardian, not to mention trips to London. We think we understand the UK and the US for that matter, but do we really understand the local context? And all the seminars I do focus on understanding the local context. Do we fathom how deep are the crumbling public services in the UK? How wide is the divide between rich and poor? Between housing possibilities, health, access to health, education. In international terms, is the UK a middle power or an actor that makes a difference? The UK, just to give an example, is forceful in its support for Ukraine, but in a recent article published by the Financial Times, a former advisor to the British Ministry of Defense said that, and I quote, Britain cannot defend the British homeland properly and is unprepared for, quote, conflict of any scale. For those and many other questions, Eunice and Julian will give us two views, internal politics and international relations. And the format will be quite simple. We shall have a half-an-hour conversation, and then we shall have a Q&A for the audience live, and you can turn on your cameras when you ask a question. Just for the introduction, Eunice Goes holds a Ph.D. in political science from London School of Economics, and she's a professor of politics at Richmond, the American University in London, and editor of the journalRenewal, a journal of social democracy. She's an expert on British party politics with a focus on the role of ideas and ideology in electoral programs. Her latest book, Social Democracy, was published this year by Agenda Publishing. Eunice, before she became academic, she was a journalist, and so she knows what journalists need, and also she is born in Portugal. Sir Julian King is a specialist partner at Flint Global. He will address foreign affairs. He's a British diplomat. He's chair of the Charity Corporation Ireland, member of the Ditchley Council, fellow of RUSI, and the Oxford Internet Institute. He was the last British European Commissioner, serving as EU Commissioner for Security Union from 2016 to 2019, with responsibility for counterterrorism, cybersecurity, tackling hybrid threats, disinformation, and security critical infrastructure. He studied at Oxford University and École Nationale d'Administration in Paris, so he's a true European. I don't know if he still remained after Brexit a true European. Well, I want to say we shall start with you. Could you please set the context? What is it that are the main issues that British voters care about? What is in the offer? Just one last sentence. We know who is going to win, or we think we know who is going to win this election. Even The Economist, the British weekly that is not known for its left-wing idea, endorses in its editorial the Labour Party. So something has gone very, very wrong with the Conservatives. What is it? There is a series of scandals. There is a crumbling public services. Could you please explain to us what is at stake? What are the issues that really matter to the voters? What is on the offer? And will Labour be able to deliver? Please, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Mirjana, and thank you very much for the invitation to address journalists from across Europe and give them a bit of a backgrounder on the British election, which is one of those paradoxical elections, because the result, as you said, has been foretold. We all know what's going to happen on the 4th of July, to which government we're going to wake up on the 5th of July. And it's been as well an extremely dull campaign, very predictable. The opinion polls have barely budged throughout the now 6 weeks of electoral campaign. Now, the announcement of the election for the 4th of July took everyone by surprise, because this was not really, a perfect time. It was not a congenial time to hold the election. The context in which this election is taking place is one that I think you can fit in 2 words: nothing works. And that's essentially the feeling of most voters. Nothing works. The waiting lists for the NHS are very long. People are waiting on average 62 days to see to have cancer treatment. They wait 12 hours in accident and emergencies to be seen by a doctor. Ambulances take a very long time to arrive at the place to essentially to treat patients. We've seen in the last weeks prisons, the criminal justice system started to release prisoners before they finish their sentences, because prisons are bursting at the seams. There are several local councils that are on the verge of bankruptcy. So it's not only Birmingham is the most famous case, but there are many others that are on the burst of bankruptcy. And this is happening as council tax has risen in the past years. My own council tax has already increased about twice this year. Every time there's a new council tax bill, there's another increase, and yet services are crumbling. We've seen roofs of schools, secondary schools, crumbling. So the physical infrastructure of schools is crumbling. But the most serious problem in education is the recruitment problem. Teachers are completely burned out because they deal with very heavy workloads. So the retention of good teachers is very, very low. There's a high turnover of teachers. And for those subjects which Rishi Sunak was very keen to emphasize and invest in, the teaching of maths in particular, well, there is a very big crisis in the recruitment of maths teachers and of English teachers. So these are the key subjects. In some cases, there's a 60% deficit in the recruitment of those teachers. So
is it because they're poorly paid?
They are poorly paid. There's been a lot of issues there's a lot of teachers and doctors have gone on strike on pay, with pay demands, and also working conditions, because the working conditions are also very, very tough. You don't want to be a teacher in a secondary school in England, because you always have somebody breathing down your neck, demanding you to do this and that. And teachers and schools are expected to essentially to solve all the inequality problems of this country, which is a very heavy demand, because schools should be about education, but schools are doing so much more than that. In fact, the poverty problems in this country have gone to the point where we have many schools in this country where headmasters are washing school uniforms, providing children with meals, families with meals, providing uniforms and so on, because there are really serious problems of poverty, and in particular of child poverty. So this is a very wealthy country, but the social problems are very, very big. And then on top of that, we have the water companies throwing sewage into the sea. So it is very likely that the next government, one of the first things that they will have to do once they come into office, is to nationalize at least one of the water companies, because those companies are on the verge of bankruptcy. So the public transport, of course, I forgot to mention, public transport infrastructure is also crumbling. Trains are completely unreliable. And if you live outside London, traveling on public transport is a huge adventure. lots of train cancellations, not to mention the poor service. There's not a lot of train connections. So the refrain, which has been heard in countless focus groups conducted by the different polling companies, but also by the political parties, is that voters are extremely tired of, 14 years of conservative government. So this is a fatigue with the same party in government for a very, very long time. But there is also the sense that their life has not improved. In fact, there was a recent poll, and I have a slide where I show the, if you give me just 1 minute, I can show you the slide where so this is a poll tracker. I'm going to show you the issues that are important for the UK voters. And the most important one is, this is a YouGov poll, it's the state of the healthcare system. And then, of course, the state of the economy, and people are essentially very worried with the cost of living, inflation. The inflation is now at 2%, but you don't feel that there's been a decline in inflation when you go to the supermarket and still in your energy bills. So one thing are the numbers that the Bank of England releases. The other thing is the everyday economy, the way that ordinary voters feel the economy in their own paychecks. And interestingly, there's been pay increases in the last year across the board, but they still do not cover the cost of living. So people are still, the average pay for the average Briton, it's still below the one of 2008. So there hasn't been an improvement in living standards. This graph here, this is from More in Common, the organization More in Common. It shows us more clearly what are the key issues of this election. So we have the cost of living. So this is the really big concern. The NHS, so voters would like to see big improvements in healthcare. And immigration is the third issue, but as you can see in this graph, it is a much less important issue than it was in 2019 at the 2019 election, or during the Brexit referendum, where immigration and the levels of immigration played a very important role in determining the outcome of the election. So these were only the graphs I wanted to show you.
Excuse me, may I just interrupt you for a second?
Yes.
Why would people want to come to a country with all these problems? Their migration has not stopped and it has not decreased significantly. Why do people still want to come to a country with the problems you have just explained?
Well, it is true that Britain has been receiving fewer migrants than Germany or France, and to some extent Spain, in particular asylum seekers. But there's a whole range of reasons, and in particular already established communities. So you have Somali communities. There is also the English language. So people would speak English, and so it would be easier to settle in the United Kingdom because they already speak the language. And it's not for the state of the welfare or the access to benefits, which tend to be much lower than in countries of similar economic outlook as the United Kingdom. So this is a question to ask to migrants and asylum seekers. But I think most of the reasons has to do, there are family connections, there are friends already settled. And so it is a way of settling in a community where you feel more or less comfortable, as opposed to be isolated in a completely different country. Mm-hmm. So this new election, these issues have been shaping the electoral campaign. Labour is promising big change, so they say change, vote for change. Nothing works. But we still do not know very well what Labour will do. There are some interesting proposals which could be transformative in the Labour programme. Namely the New Deal for Working People, which is a package of labor rights, employment rights, and trade union rights, which is something quite radical. We have as well a program for a green transition with so the Labour Party is committed to meet net zero targets by 2030, though no one knows very well how they're going to do that. And there's the plans to create this company, GB Energy, which will not provide electricity or gas, will not provide energy for British citizens, but it is it's an investment institution. It is a public company whereby the British state will channel investment and will attract private investment to invest in the green transition. But the way that they have framed it sounds like that it is almost a utility. It is one of the most popular proposals of the Labour Party. So I have the impression that many voters think that GB Energy will be something like British Gas or Scottish Power, one of the energy providers, when in fact is not going to do any of that. Less sexy reforms that Labour is proposing, so planning reforms, devolution of power to local authorities. These sound very dull, but they have the potential to unleash new investment, and in particular investment in housing, which is very much needed in the UK. So these less sexy reform proposals, they have the potential to be transformative in the long run. But Labour has also been playing the long game. So we are here to reassure you fast. So we're going to play safe. We're going to meet deficit targets. We're not going to borrow too much to invest, etc. And then we are going to generate economic growth. And after that, we will for sure transform the country, but it is a long-term program. The Labour is already betting on being re-elected at the next election. Keir Starmer talks about a 10-year plan. The question remains, there's one important question about this that has to do with, will British voters be patient to wait for the big change? So how will Labour enter office? If Labour will keep its current public spending commitments, it will keep and respect the existing fiscal rules and the tax proposals, which so far Labour has ruled out raising all types of taxes, with the exception on the tax on non-doms, the windfall tax on energy companies, and one tax on private equity, on the profits of private equity firms. There's the source of revenue of quite scant. From the tax rises, Labour will only be able to raise around £8 billion. Well, at the beginning, I told you what is the state of public services. The needs of the country require far more than £8 billion investment. So how Labour is going to at least give something to voters, where voters will feel that life has changed a little bit for them. It is easier to see a GP. They can access cancer treatment more easily. The public infrastructure in schools is not crumbling. They will need to show some change, that living conditions have changed in order to be re-elected again. So the question that everyone is asking is, will Labour start its mandate by U-turning on its promises? It's doing the famous trick, oh, things are much worse than we were expecting, so therefore we'll need to raise taxes, so therefore we'll need to review our position on the European Union, on our relations with the European Union. And I would just say that so far Labour has ruled out rejoining the customs union or the single market, which essentially means that the way that the economic growth will be generated remains a mystery, because these are the main obstacles to economic growth in the United Kingdom.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid we are,
yeah.
I'm sure there are many questions. I will now pass immediately the screen to Julian. Foreign affairs normally do not decide the elections, but we have two wars. One war in Gaza, or the war between Israel and Hamas, affects also the British voters, many of them. We had demonstrations, etc. So could you please tell us which type of changes could we expect with the Labour in power, and especially focusing on the main topics European Union, Ukraine, Israel, and then if we have time, United States, and if we have time, other. And please, Julian, the screen is yours, but unmute yourself. Yeah, please.
No, thank you. I'll try and be reasonably brief, and then there's some time for questions, which I hope we can invite the audience to join in. As we've heard, the election campaign and the issues that have dominated it, like in most election campaigns, have been very largely domestic. The Labour Party are promising a government that will be organised around key missions, and we've just heard about some of those. None of the key missions that they've set out is sort of explicitly about foreign relations. But obviously, foreign relations will affect their ability to deliver some of their key missions, for example, on the green transition, or crucially, the central mission of refiring growth. But they will have to work out how to situate the foreign dimension of their domestic focused administration to deal with some of the issues that we've been talking about. So on the foreign policy side, they have sought to send a message of continuity and reassurance in what you have just said are obviously quite challenging circumstances, both in Ukraine and in the Middle East. But also, they're trying to send a message. Starmer himself, personally, is trying to send a message of reassurance, confidence about Britain's role in the world, in part to contrast with his predecessor as leader of the Labour Party. We have to recognise the politics of this as well. His predecessor, as you will all know, Jeremy Corbyn, was quite far to the left in traditional British terms, and who had quite critical views of traditional British foreign policy, which went down well with some, but alienated a great many who didn't vote Labour last time, and who Starmer was very keen to win back for Labour by emphasising what he would regard as traditional British foreign policy ideas and values, which include being proud of your country, thinking your country can act for good in the world, talking about what your country can do in the UN, in NATO, in the neighbourhood, in support for Ukraine, for example, and further afield, thinking about the Middle East and indeed the Asia Pacific, where the UK is engaged through an alliance with Australia and the United States called AUKUS. So being sort of forward about what the UK can do in the world, including for the good, and being reasonably firm on defence, and still talking about a positive role for the UK on development. That's been the underlying political message, to try and win back patriotic Labour voters who were worried by some of Jeremy Corbyn's policies. What's it all going to mean in practice when they get in? Well, they're going to have a good deal of continuity on foreign policy. So it's absolutely clear that they will continue the UK policy of solid support to Ukraine, including both materiel support, i.e. military support, and funding support, and that they will want to work closely with a range of allies to try and do that, that they want to send a positive message on defence. As has already been suggested, there are some challenges on the defence budget side, but the defence budget has gone up recently. The existing government, Conservative government, said that they would get it up to 2.5% of GDP by 2030. Labour, recognising, as we've already heard, the challenge on the economy and growth, have been a little bit more circumspect. They say that they will target 2.5% of GDP when the fiscal circumstances allow. They will be active On development policy, which has traditionally been a Labour strong point, at various times in the past, Labour governments have had a separate development ministry. At the moment, under the Conservative government, the development ministry has been combined with the foreign ministry. So we have a Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, one ministry. Labour have said they will not indulge in machinery of government changes on this side. So they won't roll the development ministry out separately, but they will re-emphasize the importance of development in British foreign policy. This government, Conservative government, also reduced the amount of money that was spent on development from 0.7% of GDP to 0.5% of GDP. Still quite a lot relative to some other countries, but less than in the recent past. Labour, again, have said, with a certain amount of prudence, they will target raising development spending back up to 0.7% of GDP when the fiscal circumstances allow. On other areas, they will come under a certain amount of pressure, including from their own supporters. So on the Middle East, as you mentioned, this is one of the issues that has cropped up a little bit during the election campaign, not as much as you might have expected, but there are a group of Labour Party supporters who would like to see a more sympathetic position on Palestine, who would like to see faster movement towards recognition of Palestine as a state, and Labour will have to work out how they manage that pressure. At the moment, they're saying that they agree that Palestine's statehood should be recognized, but they're not saying when, as part of a constructive approach to the peace process. They will have to deal with the United States. Obviously, the prospect of a Trump presidency looms large in thinking in the UK, as it does across Europe and elsewhere. In the past, some leading Labour politicians have said quite critical things, some very critical things about Donald Trump, and they're having now to find ways of putting those in context against the possibility that he might come back as president, and that inevitably the United Kingdom and the United States will have to find ways of working together. There's also been a certain amount of outreach, not only to the Democrats, where relations are obviously strong, but also to the Republicans. That will be a challenge. They will have to deal with China, not least because the US are pressing all of their allies to get tougher on China, but also because the UK, now it's outside the EU, finds itself between two large trading interests, between three large trading interests: the United States, the European Union, and China. And it will have to find a way of navigating its economic and trade policy between those different interests and blocs. They will have to deal with questions around migration, which we've already touched upon and which we can come back to. And they will, in a piece of change from the existing government's policy, want to look at their relationship with their European neighbours. This is perhaps the biggest single area where they're going to be doing something different because they want to, rather than because of external challenges that they have to deal with. They have said for some time that they want to find a way of resetting the relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union after Brexit and after the difficult years that followed that under the Conservative government. They've said that within constraints, as we've already heard. So in order not to scare off those voters who had voted for Brexit, who they want to win back to support Labour, they've made it very clear that there are some so-called red lines. They will not be rejoining either the single market or the customs union. But within those red lines, they want to find different ways of cooperating and working better with the European Union, in particular around security and defence. So they, in one of the areas of the manifesto where they spell out a new and different initiative, they've said that Labour will seek an ambitious new UK-EU security pact to strengthen cooperation on the threats that we all face. And they've spoken about that security pact being really quite broad. So doing foreign policy, security, defense cooperation, defense capability, defense industry cooperation, thinking about how you could work better together on migration, thinking about how you could work better together on energy security, and also building up resilience. So thinking about how you deal with some of the challenges around access to critical infrastructure, critical inputs, and the resilience of your supply chain. So quite a broad agenda of issues that they would want to pursue there. They've also picked out one or two economic issues that they would like to pursue with the EU, a better arrangement for veterinary cooperation to help both goods that are to do with veterinary controls and phytosanitary controls to move backwards and forwards. An arrangement for the mutual recognition of professional qualifications so that some service providers would be able to work more easily. And in a slightly niche point, but it attracts a great deal of interest, they've said that they'd like to have a conversation about facilitating the movement of touring artists, so that both, pop groups and artists can continue to ply their trade more easily across Europe. It's interesting that they pick out a small number of specific economic issues. There are obviously lots of wider issues, but how you get into those while respecting the red lines of not reopening the customs union and the single market will be one of the issues for a Labour government. Unlike recent times on Europe, where conservative governments have consistently faced pressure from some of their supporters to move further away from the EU, one of the things that will change, I think, after the election is that a Labour government will face pressure from some of its supporters to try and move closer, faster towards the European Union. And it'll be interesting to see how the dynamics of that work politically. It's not something that we've experienced in the UK recently. The last thing I wanted to say before we move on was that they have set themselves also quite an ambitious agenda of internal reviews on foreign policy issues. So there's going to be a budget. We didn't touch upon that, but many of the policies, domestic and foreign, obviously will depend on the funding arrangements to be set out in various spending reviews and a budget later this year. On the foreign policy side, they've also committed to a strategic defense review. They've committed to a national security review, which I think is mostly about internal security matters, very rapidly. And they've also committed to doing an audit of the UK's relationship, in some cases its dependencies, with China, which will cover both economic issues and wider security issues. Why do I mention that? Well, I just think that there's going to be a challenge for an incoming government that is trying to work out what it thinks about some of these difficult issues at a time when world events will be moving very, very fast. I think they haven't yet entirely settled how they're going to manage long-term planning at the same time as dealing with the pressing, urgent foreign policy agenda that all governments will have to face, particularly in the Middle East and on Ukraine. On the foreign policy side, last point, they get off to a cracking start. Just after the election, there is the NATO summit in Washington. And just 10 days after that, the Prime Minister, we're assuming it's Starmer, will be hosting something called the European Political Community, as many of you will know, something that Macron originally proposed, a gathering of 40 plus wider European countries in the UK, in fact, at Blenheim Palace on the 18th of July. So they have two big international events right at the start, which will obviously be both a platform and an opportunity to set out their ambitions on foreign policy, but also will mean that there'll be a big focus an uncommonly sharp focus for a brand new government on what they say and what they do on foreign policy issues. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Julian. Please raise your hand and you can turn on the camera and ask live questions. Before I give the word to whoever, I just have a very simple question. I was a journalist, I'm not a diplomat, and I am not a politician, but how can, if the future Labour government doesn't raise taxes, how can they meet all these targets? How can you finance the war in Ukraine? How can you increase development spending and at the same time solve all this range of issues in the UK that the voters expect will improve? Can one of you, is the money going to come from for all these things? And can one of you just give a short reply? Eunice?
Yes, of course. I was just unmuting myself. Well, for defense, Labour has said they will borrow to essentially invest in defense. It's very important. It's been very important for Labour to show its patriotic credentials and to be on the side of the armed forces and about Britain's role in the world. But of course, then the tough choice is essentially they will be borrowing to pay for defense, but there will be cuts in domestic policy, which will be very, very hard. And so far, for instance, they are committed to not to lift the cap, the cap on the two-child benefit cap, which is one conservative policy that is linked to the rise in child poverty. So they will keep that cap. So the choice is support Ukraine, but do very little to address child poverty in the United Kingdom.
Would you like to add, or shall we go to the first question?
Let's go to the questions in a moment, but I would just say that, not that I disagree with what's just said, but that it's quite clear that they will be under a lot of pressure on the domestic side for the reasons that have been set out.
Thank you. Anya?
They are trying to map a course forward whereby, because the economy grows, government receipts increase, and that will help them do some of the work that needs to be done on the domestic side. For the foreign policy issues, they have been quite circumspect about how quickly they'll get to some of these foreign policy targets. So the 2.5% for defense, the eventually getting to 0.7% for development. They've been very careful to say they will work towards those objectives when the fiscal situation allows, presumably precisely to deal with the kind of charge that you're doing more for people abroad than you're doing for people at home.
Okay, Angel, please introduce yourself and go ahead. And unmute yourself. Yeah.
Sorry, hello, good morning. My name is Alexandra Angel from the Austrian Press Agency. And yeah, I've got several questions actually, but I'm going to limit myself to one to start with, which is about Brexit, because I was wondering why the Labour Party hasn't mentioned it more. I know that some of the smaller parties have actually raised it, like the SNP, during the election campaign, when on the one hand, the polls seem to indicate that support has actually gone down for leaving the EU. And on the other hand, there might be something to be gained by saying we will have the means to implement all these policies. And when support, especially within the Labour Party, seems to be more on the Remain than on the Leave side. And they could, one could argue, possibly, permit themselves to lose some of the red wall votes if they can get a lot of gains in other areas. And I would be interested in getting sort of both of your takes on this, if I may. Thank you very much.
Go ahead.
Okay, so very quickly, the electoral strategy of the Labour Party has prioritized winning back the red wall and red wall voters. So therefore, that's the reason why they haven't mentioned Brexit very much. It's essentially a mute subject they all want to avoid because it will essentially I wouldn't say unravel, but it will complicate their electoral strategy. Red wall voters, this is the priority of the Labour Party.
Thank you. Julian?
So I absolutely agree with that. They have been very cautious about reigniting the passions that were felt in the immediate aftermath of Brexit, which went all the way through the 2019 election. They really don't want to have. They didn't want to have that as a major focus of this election. They do want to win this election, and they quite like to win it quite big. As we've already heard, there is quite a lot of open talk about pursuing programs over 10 years, i.e. not only winning this election, but winning the next election as well. So they want to win quite big. They want to build a solid coalition of support that might carry them through quite a lot of very difficult domestic challenges and some international challenges. And in order to do that, they have wanted, as you say in English sometimes, to avoid frightening the horses. And it's absolutely clear and deliberate on Brexit. Whenever anyone asks a question, there have been many interviews where people have asked this question, they just close it down. And they've come up with this, I won't say alternative, but this narrative around starting by refocusing on the current challenges that face the UK and Europe together, which are on the security side. It leaves them then the possibility of building on that in the future, potentially. But so far, at least, any development, they've been absolutely clear that any development in that relationship will not cross the line of joining the customs union, the single market.
Thank you. Tim Stickings, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, Tim Stickings from The National. We're based in the Middle East. Question for both of you. If Starmer comes in, he could well face a lineup of leaders like Trump and Meloni and a hard right government in France and across Europe that are hardly his natural allies. How would you suggest he deals with those leaders? And is that going to make his reset with Europe more difficult? Thank you.
Thank you. Julian?
Go ahead. You have first go.
Well, I would just say that, for instance, we may wake up on Monday with the far right government in France. And this is going to present a very immediate challenge for the incoming Labour government, in particular with the immigration policy, because the Labour government has promised to solve the boat crisis, so all the asylum seekers and migrants that come through the channel. It is very unlikely that a government with Bardella, either as Jordan Bardella as Prime Minister, or a government led by a technocrat, but where the French National Assembly has a majority of National Rally supporters, will be keen to help Britain solve the migration crisis. So that is going to be a very big challenge for the incoming government. As for Trump, well, Starmer has said that it will deal with him as he has to. He will be an American president. Britain will have to do business with the United States. It will be difficult, but they will have to deal with the problems as they come. As for Meloni, Meloni is important, but most of the relationship will be with the EU in general. And so the first point of call would be building relationships with the European Commission, and then other heads of state will be perhaps more congenial to support Britain, though with the prospects of a far-right government in France, that is going to be quite challenging.
Would you like to add, Julian?
So,
please?
no, I agree with that. So one of the changes that you will see, I think, is Under the current Conservative government, and indeed the last three Conservative prime ministers in particular, there has been a reluctance to engage with with European neighbours through the EU institutions, and I think that will change. A new government, Labour government, would be entirely open to working with the European institutions. So they'll engage if it is von der Leyen who's confirmed as the Commission President. They'll be very happy to engage. They will want to work with the institutions. They've said very clearly that they also want to rebuild relations with key European allies, particularly with Germany. They have a good relationship with the current German coalition. With France, they have a good relationship with Macron and the Élysée, which will get a bit more complicated, as we've just heard, and with Poland. And they've developed a good basic relationship with Tusk, and they will want to build on that. They also have a set of particularly security partners in the north of Europe and the Baltics, where there's long-standing cooperation, which they will want to build upon. So I think that they will have a basis for trying to manage the relationship with Europe, even though some of the individual European leaders will not necessarily be terribly sympathetic to working with a left of centre government in the UK. Trump is a separate set of issues, which they've known about for quite a long time, the potential that he comes back. And as has been said, they will rely upon the deep, structured cooperation with the United States, particularly across security and to a degree intelligence issues, to give them at least a basis for trying to find common interests. But no one's under any illusion that it'll be straightforward, as it'll be a challenge for many European countries.
Thank you. Georg?
Thank you very much indeed. Georg Grafenberg, Institute for the Danube Region, Central Europe. I have a question concerning China. It was mentioned before that there will be talks with China. Now, I wonder if these talks, if there are talks first with the European Union, because there may be common grounds and common interests, and they are similarly affected maybe by quite some issues. And GB doing it by itself alone, we have seen that with India and Japan, it's not so easy. So maybe there could be more talks with the EU concerning this matter. China. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Julian.
So I think you're right to describe the challenge in that way. An incoming government, new Labour government, will need to look at what the UK does on China, and it recognises that it can't do that completely in isolation. It needs to look at what the US is doing and the pressure from the US government, and it needs to talk to its European partners about what they're doing as well. That's one element, I think, of or one reason why they've couched this idea of a UK-EU security pact in the broadest possible terms. So yes, obviously you cooperate on foreign policy challenges and you look to see whether you can build deeper cooperation on defence issues, including defence industrial capability. But they've said that they also are keen from their side to engage European partners on this wider set of economic security issues. How do we deal with the challenges to the shared challenges to our economies that come from some of the problems that are posed by China? And I hope that it's going to be possible to have that kind of dialogue without getting caught up on questions of whether this is legitimate against the backdrop of the trade and cooperation agreement. There are some people on the EU side who on occasion say, but you're trying to, under the umbrella of security, you're trying to have a discussion about economic issues that should properly be dealt with in a different framework. I do hope that both sides will find ways of dealing with shared challenges, recognizing that we're in a different world now. The world of 2016, 2019, 20 has fundamentally changed, both on hard security issues, the threat posed by Russia in Ukraine, and on a much broader set of economic security issues. And we need to find new ways of working together that respect that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There is a question in the chat from Karolina Zbigniewska from Euronews in Poland. Will these relations with Germany, France, and Poland be bilateral or rather grouped, like Weimar plus UK, or even mediated by the EU?
Well, obviously the relationships between capitals are to an extent bilateral. There will be bilateral visits, there'll be bilateral conversations. It's not up to the UK to say whether the Weimar countries together want to talk to the UK. I think it's up to the Weimar countries. But a new Labour government will be looking for friends across Europe.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? In the meantime, I have one. I would like to ask Eunice, Alexandra, I'll give you the word, right? Just a brief question. I would like to know just briefly the role of Farage in these elections. Should one overestimate or underestimate his role, how important, and also the Liberal Democrats?
Yes. So, well, thank you for that question, because this was something that I wanted to talk about. So the role of the smaller parties. So Nigel Farage's decision to enter the electoral competition, which he at first said he wouldn't do, has complicated matters for the Conservative Party. And the reform candidates running candidates fighting several constituency seats may lead to several Conservative losses. So things were already dire for the Conservative Party. With reform entering into the electoral fray, things have got much worse. And there was one poll, and I stress it was only one poll, that suggested that Rishi Sunak may lose his seat because of a reform candidate. But this was just one poll over dozens of others that did not predict Rishi Sunak's. So it is reform is cutting through support for the Conservative Party, and it may lead to some electoral losses. But the biggest threat to the Conservative Party are the Liberal Democrats, who have been running a really good electoral campaign. If you don't remember, the Liberal Democrats paid a very heavy price for joining the coalition government with the Conservatives in 2010. In 2015, at the 2015 general elections, they were almost obliterated. It was really humiliating defeat. And now the Liberal Democrats are on course for their best result since 2005, which was a record year for the Liberal Democrats. So they may very well win over 50 seats in the country, many of them seats held by Conservatives, and not only by Conservative MPs, by quite a few Conservative frontbenchers, namely Jeremy Hunt, who's the current Chancellor of the Exchequer. So the Liberal Democrats have been running quite an unorthodox campaign in a way to getting media attention. Ed Davey, the leader, has been participating in all this media stunts, doing radical sports and so on, which is a welcome break from a very dull campaign. But he has done this as a way of highlighting issues that actually voters are very worried about, namely the state of social care in the United Kingdom, child poverty, and so on. So the Liberal Democrats have done a really great campaign, and they may gain their status as a third party in the United Kingdom, which they lost to the Scottish National Party in 2015. The Scottish National Party is going to be one of the big losers of the election too. They were hegemons in Scotland, and now they are on course to be winning only around 29 seats, and Labour regaining its foothold in Scotland. In 2019, Labour had elected only 7 MPs. Now they're on course to win around 35 MPs. So quite a lot of changes in terms of the electoral fortunes of smaller parties. And another note around the Green Party, because the Greens have also been running a very good campaign, and a campaign that might damage the electoral fortunes of the Labour Party in some key seats, namely in Bristol, where the shadow media culture, sang them debonair, may lose their seat to the Greens. So the Greens may elect four MPs, and this is their target for the election. So this shows us that this is an electoral battle that is not only between Labour and the Conservatives. This is an electoral battle that reflects a varied, diverse electorate. Shows as well some disappointment of more progressive voters with the Labour Party. It shows that there's a lot of disappointment as well with the Conservative Party by more conservative or more right-wing voters who will vote for reform. So this what is happening with the smaller parties, I think it's going to be one of the most interesting things to watch at this election.
Thank you very much. Alessandra, please.
I wanted to ask a little bit about the disillusionment of voters and what a massive challenge that must be for Keir Starmer. So what can he do that is tangible so that people feel that their lives are getting better, that progress can be made within just the first sort of period in office? And what if he doesn't succeed?
Thank you. Which one of you would like to start?
I can say something, though. These are two very difficult questions, because what can he do? The opinion polls show that voters are, on one hand, open to tax rises in order to invest in much needed public services. Though Labour has been very coy about its tax rise proposals to fund public services. There is very much this sense that voters will be disappointed very quickly. So Labour is under a lot of pressure to do things that will bring visible changes to people. So they've made proposals to invest in housing and build thousands of homes in the next 5 years. But this is the kind of investment that takes time to be visible. So they will have to start anew. And yet what Labour proposes are a lot of reviews of different policies, a lot of institution building. So lots of new institutions to deal with these problems. Now, this is all very good, but will they bring visible changes to voters? So it is something, it's going to be a very big challenge for Labour, because if the expectation is to repeat what happened in 2001, where Labour won a second victory after 97, the voters were by then quite impatient. Well, we are in a very different world from 1997, because in 1997, Britain had a growing economy. That's not the case at the moment, though the economic outlook is improving. But we're also dealing with much more impatient and volatile voters. So will voters be ready to give Labour the benefit of the doubt in 4 or 5 years' time is a question that remains open. And so the big issue for Labour to do once it gets into office is, are they going to be spending a lot of time managing voters' expectations and saying, we want to get the fundamentals right, so stability first and then big investment. So this is essentially counting on voters being extremely patient. Or will they reverse some of their promises on tax, because the needs of the country are huge. They require very big public spending commitments, and so they will have to reverse some of the promises that they made in their electoral manifesto and throughout the campaign. And starting government U-turning on electoral promises, it is not a fantastic look. especially for Keir Starmer, who has been accused of having U-turn on so many promises that he had made when he was elected Labour leader?
Thank you, Julian.
Well, very briefly, I don't disagree with that. I think that they will, they're hoping to win quite a resounding victory. And I think that they will try to, therefore, build on that to show that they are going to be a competent, coherent, reliable government. And they will seek to contrast their electoral situation with some of the developments in other countries, in Europe and indeed in the US, to try and give an image of coherence and solidity when some others have got, real domestic turbulence. But that only gets you so far. They then have to use that platform to do some of the difficult choices that have just been set out.
Well, thank you, Julian. Thank you, Eunice. I like the way you finished it. We had cool Britannia. Now we can have optimistic Britannia. I hope this optimism remains because the rest of Europe is not that optimistic. We have lots of interesting events and results to look forward to learning this week. And I do hope that our webinar contributed a little bit more to a comprehensive understanding of the situation and the context in the UK. Eunice, thank you so much. Julian, thank you. And thank you to our audience, and all the best. And let's hope democracy wins everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana, for the invitation.